engine running. Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
Advances.
Questions. Research.
technology.
Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists. Hello, welcome to the Naked Scientists podcast. This is the show that brings you the biggest breakthroughs and talks to the major movers and shakers in the worlds of science, technology and medicine. I'm Chris Smith. Today, from bogus scientific papers and misleading made-up facts to potentially curtailing our critical thinking, we're looking at the effect that mass adoption of AI could be having on the way that we think, the decisions we make, and the information we learn and act on. Artificial intelligence is being talked about and used more widely than ever. Rapid advancements in this technology have, for example, led to many remarkable and welcome breakthroughs in science and major efficiency gains in some workplaces. It seems certain that the widespread adoption of AI is also an inevitability, much like the internet and social media in the years before. But over recent months, AI concerns have come to the forefront, both for businesses and individuals, and that's what we're going to explore this week. One of the main ways that the majority of us are running into AI is via platforms like ChatGPT. These are so-called large language models, which specialise in understanding instructions that we provide in plain English and then rapidly generating summaries, explanations, or even diagrams and computer code to order. And it's very impressive. But all that glitters isn't gold, because these systems make a lot of mistakes. And as a lot of internet content is now being generated this way, we are running the risk of polluting the knowledge space with rubbish that could potentially be around as misleading distractions for decades. Here's Mike Wooldridge, Professor of the Foundations of Artificial Intelligence at Oxford University.
Large language models are quite a recent development. They've really only been around in the way that we recognize them now for about half a dozen years. And what they do fundamentally is something which everybody who's listening to this program will be familiar with. If you open up your smartphone and you start sending a text message to your mother or your partner and you say, "I'm going to be," it will suggest completions. And how your phone is doing that is it's been trained on all of the text messages that you've sent, and it's learned that the likeliest next thing to come after "I'm going to be" is either late or walking the dog, or in my case, in the pub. Large language models have been trained not just on a bunch of text messages, but essentially all of the digital information that's available in the world, essentially all of the World Wide Web, which is an unimaginably vast quantity of text. And it is really just ordinary written human text. So every web page is scraped and all the text that's on that page is extracted from it. And all of that is fed to the enormous neural networks that are in large language models, which are trained so that they can make the best prediction possible about what should come after what we call your prompt. And your prompt might be a one-paragraph summary of the life and achievements of Winston Churchill, or the recent performance of Liverpool Football Club in the European Champions League, or whatever. But all of that text, the whole of the World Wide Web, is absorbed by these vast neural networks in a process that takes typically months and requires millions of dollars worth of computer processing power. And what we end up with is something that's really quite remarkable.
And when these things are roving across the internet, hoovering up that information, is that indiscriminate? Or would it do it like you would do it, which is you'd say, here's a web page from the University of Oxford. I set that as having greater store and veracity and validity compared to a web page that was produced on someone's blog 5 years ago.
There is a certain amount of discrimination that goes on, but actually the demand for the data is so great. I mean, you really need absolutely all the data that you can throw at it, that it ends up being somewhat indiscriminate just because the demand for that data is so vast. I mean, the scale of the data is really astronomical. I mean, in the breakthrough large language model was called GPT-3, and it was released in 2020. There was 40 terabytes of ordinary written text used to train that model. That's the equivalent of millions upon millions of ordinary books. And if your demand for that text is so great, then there's a limit to how discriminating you can be. But interestingly, the evidence is the higher quality text that you're able to train your model on, the better it's going to be. So there is a market right now for that text. There are also, I have to say, some pretty unscrupulous practices that are being used by some of the large language model builders who are, if not actually breaking the law, then probably running roughshod over copyright restrictions. And there are lawsuits underway right now about that.
So if these things are just ingesting things willy-nilly and looking for connections, if you've got these engines producing this material, which then ends up on the internet, are they going to end up force-feeding themselves their own stuff? Is that like me eating my own excrement?
Yes, thank you for that, Chris. Let me put it this way. It seems inevitable to me that within 20 years at the most, but probably more likely within 10, essentially everything that we read on the internet, on the World Wide Web, is going to be AI generated, unless you're prepared to pay a premium for human generated content. And yes, you're absolutely right that what that means is that is the content that models are then going to be trained on. And the evidence at the moment is that models which are trained on AI-generated content are poorer. And if you just iterate that process over a few generations, it can quite quickly descend into nonsense. So this is one of the big conundrums of the age in AI. Where are we going to get that future data from? And how are we going to ensure that models aren't just trained on AI slop, as it's now called? But also, what this signals is there is going to be a market for human-generated content. Data which is written text or whatever kind of content that's created by human beings will remain extremely valuable.
The other thing that we've heard about is that these models do tend to make stuff up. So if they are just stringing together material that they have gathered from across the internet, why do they make stuff up?
These models have no conception of what's true or false. They're simply designed to make the best guess possible about what should come after your prompt. And in particular, in the absence of any information, they will fill in gaps. But the weirdly troubling thing about this is they will fill in those gaps in extremely plausible ways. And that means that not only do they get things wrong, they get things wrong in ways that are actually quite difficult for us to detect. So here's my favorite example. An early large language model that I tried out, I asked it about me. And when we finally got to the Michael Wooldridge that wasn't the Australian health minister or the BBC news reporter, we finally got to me, it said, Michael Wooldridge, Professor of Artificial Intelligence, tick, known for work on multi-agent systems, tick. And then it said it studied at the University of Cambridge. And I never studied at the University of Cambridge. I never had any affiliation with the institute. So why is it getting it wrong? Because actually for an Oxford professor, that's quite a common background. And in the absence of any information, it's kind of filling in the gap in a very plausible way. But if somebody read that, they wouldn't notice that because it sounds plausible. So they get things wrong a lot, and they get things wrong in extremely plausible ways. And that makes it very hard to detect those falsehoods. You may have heard recently that GPT-5 was released. So GPT-3 from OpenAI was really, for me anyway, was the breakthrough large language model. That was really eye-opening. It was a huge step change in capability over its predecessor. And then GPT-4, released about 2 years after that, was also a step change in capability. The one thing I think that would have made the biggest difference in GPT-5 was if it was better at not producing falsehoods. And the problem is, it still seems like that's a really, really big issue. And if I had to identify right now the single biggest barrier that's in the way of the wider take-up of these models, it's this fact that they just get things wrong so often. They get things wrong a lot, and they get things wrong in very plausible ways.
Professor of the Foundations of Artificial Intelligence at the University of Oxford, Mike Wooldridge there. And the same large language model told me that famous astronomer, now sadly deceased, Sir Patrick Moore, started the Naked Scientists. That is definitely not true either. Now, AI can make research faster and more in-depth when it's used correctly. But AI confabulation, like claiming Patrick Moore created the Naked Scientists, could have serious impacts on the quality of scientific literature. We're already seeing studies and review articles written using just AI essay mills. These are AI-generated pieces of writing that also contain completely made-up information, including invented references created to support a particular line of argumentation, as well as facts that are just plain wrong. But they look and read so well that the scientific wheat can be very hard to separate from the chaff. Some of these studies are definitely slipping through the cracks and getting into journals. In other situations, people are generating articles with AI and then they send them to paid-for publication outlets where others can rely on them without realising that a human didn't create or check them properly. Other AIs can also then ingest and regurgitate this same information. This challenges the integrity of the published studies and the trust between everyday people and scientific information. To find out how trust in the scientific community can be maintained in the age of AI, here is Jennifer Wright from Cambridge University Press, Head of Publication Ethics and Research Integrity.
When you're a scientist, you look at someone else's research and you think, is this good? Is this really correct? Is there something that they've missed? Is there something they should have accounted for? Is that method the right approach? And this is essentially what we do today through a process called peer review. So experts in a topic take a paper, they look at it, they grill the work, they critique it, and then they determine whether or not it's suitable for publication at all, or maybe whether there's some improvements that the author or researcher could make to make it suitable.
And obviously, your venue has a reputation to defend, but not all venues do that, do they? I mean, not all publishers operate the way Cambridge does. There are some where I just send them a very large check and they publish anything. I've come across these on the internet.
Unfortunately, this is becoming increasingly challenging. There's something called hijacked journals, which are essentially really sophisticated spoofs of real journals. So let's say you had the Journal of Interesting Research, and that's a legitimate journal by a legitimate publisher. There might also be another Journal of Interesting Research, and that is a predatory journal or a hijacked journal. And they can be very sophisticated, so researchers and readers might not even realize that they're looking at a predatory journal.
What's the purpose of those places existing though? Is this people burnishing their CV? So if I want to get some extra publications and make myself look like a better scientist than I am, I can generate some content and send it to one of these journals who ask few questions but will just generate the publication, and that turns into CV points for me. I mean, is that the purpose?
There's probably a lot of motivations, as with anything like this. It could be naivety. It could be that the researcher doesn't realize this isn't a legitimate outlet. It could be pressure to publish, which you've alluded to, that a lot of academic careers are built on your publication record. So a shortcut to a publication record might be attractive to certain people in certain parts of the world as well, where they have really strict requirements around you can't graduate until you have a paper, you maybe can't get a promotion until you have a paper. So with that incentive structure, it becomes very difficult to resist, perhaps.
Jennifer Wright there. Bogus research and predatory journals are nothing new, but recent advancements in generative AI have turbocharged the ease with which content can be produced, with plausible papers now popping up at the click of a button. These studies are often littered with confabulations, which unsuspecting readers can mistake for legitimate findings. Here's Marie Soulière, Head of Editorial Ethics and Quality Assurance with the open access publisher Frontiers.
The real concerns are about inaccurate or false content, what we refer to as hallucinated content from the artificial intelligence, hallucinated references. If the AI does plagiarism, if there's poor attribution of content without referring to the real source, this is actually what we are really concerned about, rather than AI being used for the benefits that it can provide, because it is a very efficient and effective tool for analysis of research data. It can free up time for researchers to carry out more research, and it really, really supports non-native English speakers, who are the majority of the population of researchers in the world.
Given that it can churn out very slick, very nice-looking content that's extremely plausible and could therefore deceive reviewers, because unless they're going to check everything in excruciating detail, things could slip through. Does that not worry you, though, that this is going to create a lot of work for reviewers to be able to say, honestly, I've really, really checked this and I've checked every reference. I know absolutely this is rock solid, which, let's face it, no one's got enough time to do exactly that.
Agreed. And what we've been doing is, in a way, fighting AI with AI. So there's a lot of tools that have been created to support publishers in the industry. And everything is focusing on the root cause of the problem. We cannot detect AI-generated content. It's very difficult, and there's very low accuracy for this. So what we do is focus on everything else that might be wrong with the article that could be a symptom of a fake paper. So we're looking at tortured phrases, some problematic content, data that looks a bit dodgy, gibberish images, wrong attributions, so that they don't get published and become part of the literature.
With a very, very high quality venue like Frontiers that has a reputation to defend, that is the case. But there are lots and lots of journals. They don't have the kinds of checks and balances that you have. And the problem that stems from that is the AI platforms that people are using and training are just romping their way around the internet, sucking all this stuff up and incorporating it into the model that they then use to generate papers that do go into legitimate sources and reputable venues like those that you publish. And so it does have the potential to build up like a layer of plastic on the seafloor and pollute the knowledge space for years to come, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And this is a frequent concern that's raised by researchers and publishers alike. I was at the Frankfurt Book Fair last year at the big event. There was a whole AI day with publishers. People were talking about how these non-peer-reviewed articles in archive or in predatory publishers are taken with the same level of legitimacy as peer-reviewed articles. And AIs are not taking this into consideration, or the developers are not, because these articles, the real ones versus the archives, are tagged with a little label that says it's been peer-reviewed. And the AIs should be able to make a distinction, but not with the predatory publishers. And that's the biggest risk.
Marie Soulière from Frontiers Publishing House. Increased vigilance from publishers, editors and researchers is crucially important to combat this problem. But another way to beat AI pollution of the knowledge pool could mean changes to the way scientists document their work. Here's Jennifer Wright from Cambridge University Press again.
We also promote open science principles at Cambridge. So you can think of this like the show your working mode of research. It's not enough to just present the outcome. The researcher needs to be able to kind of show the journey, ideally whilst they're doing it. But a paper trail of this was my lab work, this is the microscope I used, this is when I went to the field, that's much harder to fabricate than some words on a page. So I think that's something else that builds trust, is being able to see that journey. It's also about collaboration across publishers, institutions, funders, libraries, all coming together to look at what can we really do about this pressure to publish culture, incentive structures. How can we turn down the tap rather than just filtering the water? So Cambridge are working on this just now. We've got a white paper coming out in the autumn, which is going to look at some of these big systematic challenges and what we can actionably do about it.
Jennifer Wright at Cambridge University Press. It is good to know that big players are taking this very seriously, but the risk that we are poisoning the knowledge well is a very real one, and it has implications for the way we think and learn in future. And that's what we're going to think about next.
The Naked Scientists podcast is produced in association with Spitfire, cost-effective voice, internet and IP engineering services for UK businesses. Find out how Spitfire can empower your company at spitfire.co.uk.
Music in the programme is sponsored by Epidemic Sound, perfect music for audio and video productions.
This is the Naked Scientist podcast with me, Chris Smith, and this week we're looking at the effect of mass AI adoption on the knowledge space, our bodies and our brains. Speaking of which, in recent months, doctors and nurses have seen a rise in patients being admitted for AI-related issues. In one extreme example, a 60-year-old went to hospital in the United States claiming he was being poisoned by a neighbour. He'd been using sodium bromide instead of salt, sodium chloride, on his food for the previous 3 months after asking ChatGPT to suggest salt alternatives to lower his blood pressure. He developed bromism, which can cause psychosis and hallucinations, and it took him several weeks, free of sodium bromide, to recover. People are also using ChatGPT for mental health advice and to seek companionship. As a result, a new term called AI psychosis is being used to describe users of AI chatbots who are losing touch with reality as a result. Some speculate the immersive nature of the interactions we can have with these systems can make them very provocative stimuli capable of triggering the emergence of psychotic states in some vulnerable people. I've been speaking with consultant psychiatrist at the Priory Hospital, Roehampton, David McLaughlin.
There have been a couple of case studies recently where members of the public have developed psychosis, which involves kind of conversational AI like ChatGPT. So people have believed that they're really speaking to a real person, or they've developed paranoid delusions that have involved ChatGPT or other generative AI. And that's really excited journalists recently, and there's been lots of headlines about AI psychosis.
Do you think this is a new phenomenon, as in this is a new risk, a new outcome, and it's because of a new technology? Or do you think that these people were always going to be vulnerable and it's just this that's doing it, rather than 20 years ago it would have been the television or the radio that was provoking this?
Exactly that. One of my pet peeves has been the media misrepresentation that this is a new condition, that this is a new disease or new illness that we all of a sudden need to pay attention to. Psychosis is an illness where people develop hallucinations. So a hallucination is when people perceive a sensory stimulus that isn't there. So they might hear a voice, or they might even have visual hallucinations, seeing things that aren't there. This illness, psychosis, has always existed. The underlying neurobiological abnormalities, so that's the differences in the brains of people that have psychosis, hasn't changed. It manifests in different ways according to the world that we live in. So the things that we become delusional about take on